you, Jenny. Great. Thank you very much, Jenny. Again, we're excited here to be with you today to learn about composting. We're going to start by looking at a couple different ways that we manage food waste as well as yard debris here in Thurston County. You do have the option of a curbside pickup. Along with your trash. You can subscribe to that via, again, whoever your hauler is. You can self-haul it yourself to the Thurston County Waste and Recovery Center, and that's over in Hawks Prairie, or you can compost at home. For today's presentation, we're going to just focus in on the composting at home part. And so if you have other further questions, there'll be a follow-up email at the end. You can email us your specific questions if you have other questions about curbside or self-haul pickup or drop-off issues. So for today, I also will let you know that within this 1 hour, it's very tough to cover everything that you do need to know about composting. I will encourage you to go back and watch this webinar link that is on our YouTube channel. This webinar that we did it during the pandemic, and so we had a little bit more extra time allotted for that. And so it's, I think, an hour and a half or hour and 45-minute long composting workshop. So you can get a little bit more information from there, or you can, again, send us a direct email with your question. Okay. So we're going to start off with what is compost. If we actually look at the composting definition from the dictionary, this is what it says. Composting is simply a combination of yard debris like grass clippings or fallen leaves and or kitchen scraps such as fruit or vegetable spoils separated from the waste stream and placed into an environment suitable for decomposition. So typically, if you think about what things in your household are you either looking at composting or are currently composting, we're going to go over some other items that you might be able to expand that list about. At the end, that finished compost is ultimately going to be a fertilizer of sorts so that you can actually help put those nutrients back into the soil. Composting is very much a science, but it is also part art. And it's kind of, it's similar to baking a cake or following a recipe. You can put lots of different variables, but certain things do need to be part of that recipe in order for it to turn out. For example, if baking a cake, if you didn't have all the ingredients, the cake may not rise. But what is unique is the ingredients that you put in it. So you could make a strawberry cake, a chocolate cake, a vanilla cake. Same thing with compost. You'll have different inputs. And ultimately, some of that, the right balance or the right ratios need to happen in order for finished compost to actually happen. So today we're going to go over some of those parts about what is necessary in order for the composting process to work. And then you'll decide what are your inputs, what type of compost you want to use. So before we begin all of this, there's three kind of main questions you should be asking yourself about composting. And the first one is, how much space do you have? So if you currently already composting, look at how much space are you dedicating for composting. If you're ready to start brand new, figuring out what space you have available is critical. And also it's based on our next question is how much you're also producing. So for those that are living in a single resident home, those that have acreage, or those that live in a high-rise building, all can compost. It's just different methods or different styles in which you would go about achieving that goal. How much waste do you have is our second question. And so are you a single family resident or do you have 2 or 3 folks living within your residence, or multiple people, 5, 6, 7 plus? So that will also determine the style of composting, because the larger the amount of people in your house, the different composting practices are needed. Where again, if you have 1 or 2 people in your household, you have different options available to you as well. Our last question here is, what materials would you like to compost at home? And that's where you have to evaluate what items are you producing that you would like to remove from your waste stream and actually process on site. So that could be anything from yard debris all the way up to food scraps. And so here is a list of some things that we can compost, and that is typically put into the waste stream that we could actually remove, which would provide greater benefit to you. Here's The more common ones are the fruit and vegetable matter and the yard debris, lawn clippings. Those are pretty common thoughts. But here are some other things that might also be able to be diverted from your waste stream. Certain paper products there that are uncoated, sawdust, wood chips. Smaller is better, so it helps with some of the bulking agents there. Eggshells, coffee grounds and filters, tea bags, and some manures. And we'll go over the manure here in just a bit. Here is a list of a few things that you should not compost at home. And there's the most kind of obvious ones where are obviously trash or hazardous waste. But here are some of the things that typically do get put in compost piles. And again, the compost pile I'm talking about is one that you would be managing on site at your house. This is not a list that is necessarily the same for a commercial composting facility. For example, if you were to put meats, you could do that if you have a curbside organics bin. You could put meats in your curbside organics bin because that goes to a commercial facility where the temperatures that they do to process that compost is much higher than what you can in your own yard. So for this list here, this is for what residents can do as far as what they should and shouldn't put in their compost pile. So meats, oils, dairy foods, those things tend to coat the food, which prevents the bacteria getting past that oil layer or fat layer in order to break down that material. And what happens is that food tends to go rancid before that bacteria is able to actually break through that barrier and actually start to decompose that food. So spoiled food, other things that pathogens, for example, you have a dented can of soup. Botulism is definitely a concern. And so you don't want to be putting spoiled food that has a pathogen risk into your pile. For example, if some things get like lettuce gets a little moldy or something like that, that's fine. But something that has a higher risk, like I said, dented cans tend to be that because again, the botulism risk. I would not be putting that in my compost bin. Certain weeds are fine. Typically, it's best to do them before they've gone to seed. That's just because the hot temperatures of your compost pile won't always kill off the weed seeds. And so some of that will remain. And so you don't want to spread seeds all over your yard. Diseased or thorny plants, that's just for a safety issue. And it's also harder for them to break down. It takes longer time. Limited citrus or cedar, both of these products here, citrus and cedar, both are natural antibacterial killers. In a compost pile, you want to actually be a bacteria farmer. You want to encourage bacteria in your compost pile because those microorganisms are the things that are breaking down all of these different materials. So a little bit of oranges, peels, or lemons or limes is fine. But if you had a big party, or for example, schools tend to have an issue with this, is that if they're eating oranges in large volumes, it could definitely stall your pile. Same thing with cedar or other types of those products, natural cleaners. Treated painted wood, also bacteria can't get past that surface layer in order to get and process the wood. Plastics and bioplastics, you'll see a lot of things that are, say, compostable. They're just not compostable in a home situation. So those bioplastics are things that don't tend to break down in our home systems. Some barbecue ash is fine, just not huge volumes of it. Again, it kind of neutralizes the abilities for the microorganisms to do their jobs. Liquids are fine. Again, water is best. If you put in a lot of other things, like, for example, you had a picnic or barbecue and you have a bunch of lemonade or teas in that, you put that in, and what happens is you'll end up attracting other things like yellow jackets. It's more of a safety issue on that part. Dirt and soil, you don't really need to put any of that in your pile. When you're building your pile, you'll need a little bit first to establish those microorganisms in that new pile. But after that, you shouldn't have to put any dirt or soil into your pile. It should be able to exist on its own with the correct amount of microorganisms. And then last, pet manures, we are fine as far as it goes for chickens. Let's say alpacas, rabbits, all those are high producing manures, meaning they provide a lot of heat. And so that's an option for you. Also, cow and horse are fine. The ones that you want to avoid are pet, which is dog, cat, and pig. Those are the three in a home system. The pathogens that are potentially in those manures will not be destroyed in the composting process. So again, um, horse, cow, and then anything sheep, goat, alpaca, rabbit, chickens are fine. We just want to avoid dog, cat, and pig in a home system. Also, you want to try to avoid diseased plant material. Right now, you'll see some of the leaves as they're falling off there. A little bit of a spotting is fine, but if you have a whole plant that has, been really struggling with a disease there, don't put those leaves into your pile. And that's just because some of those spores, again, aren't killed off in the decomposition process. And so you don't want those to be established in your finished compost, and then you spread that all over your garden. So heavily diseased materials really should go into the trash. Okay, so we're at our first question break. So if you have any questions, you can type it into the Q&A function, and we'll see if I can answer them there. And if not, we'll keep going.
Yeah, there's no questions right now, Corey.
Okay, great. So we'll keep going. All right, let's now move into the actual composting process. So what does it take in order for compost to happen? And so I'm looking at the composting process kind of in this example like a car. So typically, we have two main systems or ways that compost can happen. One that is assisted with a human and one that's not. So the natural process of compost happens, whether humans are involved in it. And that would be organic waste decomposing with the help of the microherd, which is bacteria, fungi, worms, arthropods. That process is always happening. Whether the humans are involved will determine how fast the process happens. So if we look at this car here, typically you have fuel, which is our organic waste, things like leaves and fruit and vegetable scraps. And the microherd is feasting and breaking that down. And then at that point, ultimately over time, and it's a slower process, ultimately you will get finished compost. If you want to speed the composting process up, we as humans can insert ourselves into that by making sure that we have the right ratios of certain things like oxygen or water or the right ingredients. And so by doing that, we make the composting process go faster. So in this composting process, you need all three of these things in order to do what's called active or hot composting, is to speed the process up. So that's where the human operator would be, is to try to move that process faster. So here are the kind of main categories for composting. The passive or cold system, which basically means you throw the items in your pile. This could be in your yard somewhere, and basically within 2 years, without doing any other really involvement with it, it will actively break down. But the process is slower and typically takes up to 2 years for a pile to naturally break down of, like, let's say weed or grass clippings in your yard. If you want that pile finished within, let's say, 4 to 6 months, you can actually be inserting yourself into that process, which then moves it to an active or hot composting system. And then there's two other major types of composting that we typically also encourage in this part of the country here, which is vermicomposting, which is composting with worms. Worms being one of the processors for after the bacteria break down the food scraps, then the worms actually also process the rest of that. And then the last one is called bokashi. And that process, all of the three that we've just talked about, the passive, the active, and the vermicomposting, all require oxygen. Bokashi is the opposite. It is the lack of oxygen. You're trying to remove the oxygen from the process, and it's more like a fermentation of the fruit and vegetable scraps. It ultimately does result in finished compost, but it's a completely different science method. So if you're interested in learning more about that, there are a bunch of resources, books, and online videos that you can read or watch all about bokashi. And that's bokashi typically is more for managing for food scraps, not necessarily for large volumes of leaves or yard debris. So each of these have different pros and cons, and we'll see some of that as we go through a couple more slides. So let's look at our first method, which is the passive or cold system. Typically, it doesn't cost anything because you're literally just using a space in your yard. It requires less work because the fact that you're just putting it in a pile, you're not turning it, you're not doing anything else except by adding more contents to it. Um, and it's basically, like I said, it'll be done typically in 2 to 3 years plus. So that's what's considered cold or passive system. The one bonus part about that is that you're not restricted by the pile size there. The one thing that's a downside of that particular style is that you don't want to put a lot of food scraps in it because it is not covered. Then you're also risk as far as having animals come in and also like raccoons, possums, etc. Go through and scavenge your pile. So it's definitely food scraps are not ideal for this type of system unless you really bury them in there. But even that, it still risks mice, rats, etc., from finding that food. The one bonus part about also the cold or slow composting is that it is in touch with the ground below, which allows the microorganisms from the soil below to actively move in and out of the pile, which also helps with the decomposition process. So again, doesn't require a lot of work, meaning you're just putting it in and watching, and it's the watch and wait and see kind of process. And here's another example of that, just again, a pile. All right, our next system is the active or hot system. And the difference between these two is that so there's some equipment differences, but also you are more of an active role in this process. So you plus turning the pile and making sure that it has the right moisture content and the right materials will increase the rate of decomposition so that you will have finished compost typically between 4 and 6 months from when you started the pile. And typically this process does use a bin of some sort. And there's lots of different options for that based on the size of your yard. So here are a couple of the plastic style bins that are typical. And so each of these have their different pros and cons. And we have a pro and con bin list that we can share with you so that you can go through and see the different pros and cons of each of these different styles. The top one here has less airflow in it, and so it's better for food waste because it doesn't allow the rodents to get in there or any other types of critters. The photo on the bottom there is called a biostack, and you actually break these apart by layers. And this is good for yard debris typically because you don't have to cut it up as much into the smaller pieces. You can still have some of the bigger, bulkier stuff in there. So typically the bins that you buy typically are in this correct size, meaning 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet is actually the scientific proven size for the highest rate of decomposition based on the ratios that we said before about having the correct amount of air, the correct amount of water, and then the right contents in it. So most bins that you purchase are already in this 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet size, and you just need to make sure that you're watering it and turning it to make sure that oxygen gets into that pile. The one bonus part about this is that with these bins there is that you can get a little bit higher temperatures than you would, let's say, a cold system. And so you may actually be able to kill off some weed seeds, especially if your temperatures are over that 140-degree mark. And I think it's good for both food and yard waste. So it is beneficial for both. So with the containers, as we saw in our first cold or passive system, you didn't need one. But for a hot system, you tend to want to have a container in order to keep it that 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet size. And so here are some examples. These are all different types of bins that are all produced via more plastic as being the primary content of them. and lots of different choices. So this one on your right is just a collection bin. It's just a piece of plastic that has some attachments points there where you can just fill in, and then the oxygen flows freely in and out of the pile. We've already gone through the two in the middle, and then the far left is another category that's commonly found here called the tumbler style. That is the one style of bin that we typically recommend that you don't have, because the fact that it is so far removed from the ground. So, for example, when those all these other bins here all have soil contact. So the three other bins that are on this photo right now all have the ability for microbes to get from the soil into the pile naturally without you being part of that. If you see the tumbler style on the left, you have to be the one to make sure that the microbes are in there, because they can't obviously jump from the soil layer all the way up into the bin. So it's not to say that the tumbler styles can't work. You, as the operator, just need to spend more time making sure that your recipe is right and that you have enough microbes in there, enough moisture, and enough air so that the pile will still break down. Here's a couple of our other types. Wood bins are also a function, and then we also have the wire mesh bins that are also there on the left. And both of those have their own sets of pros and cons. And like I said, our last one is the active or the passive pile, which is basically just throwing it on, and we'll see you in 2 years. So this slide here has a QR code. If you do have your phone by you and you want to take a photo of this, you can link to our webpage that actually you can download the handout that goes through all the different pros and cons of each of these lists. If you don't have your phone with you right now, don't worry. This information will be in the follow-up email that we send out with the additional resources, and you can also access it at that time. Okay, so now we're on to questions.
There are no questions right now, Corey.
Okay, we'll keep going then.
Okay.
All right, it's now time to build a pile. So at this point, we have our location. We've determined what types of materials we want to compost. And so now we are looking at where should we actually put our composting pile. So the first thing to do is think about is location. You want to have it where you can use it. So it can't be too far away on your property so that you're not wanting to actually go out and access it. Especially, you have to think about not only in the summertime, but also in the wintertime too. And so you don't want to have it be so far back. Let's say you have a couple acres. You don't want to have it so far in the back of your property where you're not going to be wanting to walk from your house all the way out there to take out your food scraps. At the same time, you don't want it right next to a place where you're going to be doing your entertaining, let's say on your deck or on a patio there. So you have to find that spot where one, you want to make sure that it's accessible. At the same time, you also want to make sure you have access to water and your tools. And that would be the spot that I would look at to try to find a spot that works with all that. Most folks will pick a spot, but then realize that access to having water access to that pile is really difficult, which makes it very challenging for your pile to be successful. So the other important part is that with a lot of those bins that we just showed you, especially the plastic ones, they all come typically with a liner on the bottom that is provided to you. We encourage you not to use that liner, but to actually just put the bin right on top of your soil and to let those microbes that are naturally occurring in the soil to move freely again in and out of the pile. So that's why we encourage you to have that soil contact with your pile. The other important part, especially with worm composting, is that I have seen that some worm bins can exist inside the home. And then also some composting units also can exist in the home too. So you just have to determine how much space you have. If you live in, let's say, a high-rise unit, you can still do composting if you have a small patio or a deck, or some, like I said, some units are designed for kitchen. You just have to make sure you are purchasing those and what things you can and can't go into those different bin styles. All right, for the sake of time, I can't go into all the different tools and how we use them, but we did create a tool video if you would like to. Again, each of these videos we put on our YouTube channel are just a minute or two. They're not long, lengthy videos. These are just little snippets where you can watch a couple minutes about us going through the different subject material. In this case, us is just focusing about the safety of and the tools that you need to be composting safely. So we'll again put these links at the follow-up information that will be emailed to you, and you can have a chance to look at this stuff in greater detail. Here are a few things though I do want to highlight is that the number one thing that most folks forget about when you're composting is wearing gloves. And safety is really important part, especially like I said, because you are wanting to be a bacteria farmer. We want to make sure that you always wear gloves when processing your compost. And that's just to make sure that those bacteria and other things don't get into, let's say you might have a tiny cut on your hand, and that's just for safety purposes. Other things that also to keep in mind is that you want some tools in order to break up your materials. So some pruners or a little mini handsaw, having a thermometer to, if you want to test the temperature of your pile, there's lots of composting thermometers out there on the market. Wheelbarrows, buckets, tarps, and a shovel or a pitchfork or a manure fork. All of these things are, we go through the different reasons why this could be helpful in your composting process. We also provide some screening for you to screen your compost at the end. That's another tool that we also explain some benefits here as well. All right, so let's begin with the actual science part of what's happening in a compost pile. So you're going to be putting these different ingredients into your pile. Some of them are considered carbons and others are considered nitrogens. And typically, if you look at these two, carbons are what are considered browns. It has nothing to do with color. It's just the name that is associated with that particular item. And then nitrogens tend to be what are considered greens. And these, so if you look at the two items there, carbons are the bulking agents. They tend to be drier, bulkier, and provide the structure in your pile. And then the nitrogen, those tend to be the proteins. They provide the boost of energy that your pile needs in order for that recipe to work and for the decomposition process to happen. So we're going to look at now a list of what types of materials fall under these two categories, the carbons and the nitrogens, otherwise known as the browns versus the greens. So here is our list of greens and browns. And as a general rule, nitrogen materials that are high in nitrogen there tend to be more moist and dense. And here it is a list of some of the examples. More commonly, most folks always assume that grass clippings or fruit and vegetable scraps, those are all great boosting of that nitrogen to your pile. Here are the rest of them listed there. Those are things that are a little less common that folks could potentially be diverting from their waste stream. So tea bags, weeds without seeds, fresh coffee grounds, meaning coffee grounds that have been brewed within 48 hours, can be a source of nitrogen to your pile. If your coffee grounds have been sitting around in a container and they've been brewed past that 48-hour mark, then they tend to be more act like a carbon because the nitrogen has already volatilized out into the air. And so it doesn't act the same way. And so coffee grounds tend to have that rough estimate about 48 hours difference between either fresh or old. We've already gone over the manures. Again, the same thing goes for no pet manures in there. And then for the nitrogens, again, some eggshells and limited citrus there. If you put a ton of eggshells in your compost pile, you are also going to attract other things. For example, like snails, because snails are looking for sources of calcium to build their eggshell or to build their shells, and eggshells provide that source of calcium for them. And here's a list of the carbons, which again, sawdust, dried leaves, straw, cardboard, old coffee grounds, and small twigs and wood chips. So that's a short list of some of the items for our greens and our browns. All right, so if we're looking at our recipe, this is the recipe for composting success. So it's 1 green to 2 browns plus air and water equals compost. And so you're wondering, well, what does that mean? So 1 green of what? It could be 1 bucket. Let's say you have 5-gallon buckets. You could put 1 bucket of green material for every two buckets of brown material or carbons, plus air and water will eventually make a good finished compost. It could also be two wheelbarrows. So one wheelbarrow of green material to two wheelbarrows of browns, or one dump truck of green material to two dump trucks of brown materials, plus air and water. So this is the ultimate recipe from 1 to 2 plus air and water will eventually make a good finished compost. And this is our recipe that we use when you're trying to collect your materials. So you want to make sure that you have the right volume of each of these products so that the ratios are correct. We do have a greens and browns video on our YouTube channel and also a how to build a pile video. Like I said, unfortunately, we don't have the time capacity for me to get into the details for today, but we do have where we actually walk through. We have a couple of our master recycler composter volunteers actually build piles, and you can see them and how they put those ratios of buckets from 1 bucket of greens to 2 buckets of browns. All right. Any questions at this time?
No questions yet.
Okay, great. We'll keep moving. Okay, so in building a pile, a couple other tips that we should be thinking about is that we want to break things down into more smaller amounts, except for just a couple items. So you want a majority of your items to be in a smaller size, except for maybe a few items that might be, for example, maybe a stick or a bigger piece of lumber, something that provides some extra support or structure to that pile. Otherwise, everything else can be chopped up fairly small, smaller about the size of your palm of your hand or above, just around the size of your hand, is a good size for breaking things up. The reason the smaller the better is that it provides more surface area for the microbes to actually engage with that particular material. So if you have really giant pieces of lumber in there, it is going to take those microbes a lot more time to break down that piece of log compared to a smaller microbe that actually can provide more surface area if those pieces were broken up into smaller pieces. So our words are break, bruise, and bash. It's always fun to kind of go out there and break up these materials into smaller pieces there, and it gets you more engaged with your compost. Oops. The other important part about this is that we want to make sure that we're watering properly and that we get the right amount of oxygen in our pile. And we do that when we get the right ratios of materials and the water and the oxygen. Ultimately, there are going to be heat produced from those microbes processing all of that. And so that's where the warmth happens. So typically when you build a pile, you will see a temperature spike in that pile. And that's just, again, the microbes starting to break down all of that material there. Ultimately, those temperatures will decrease. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we're starting our pile off by making sure that we have the right ratios of water, oxygen, and the right materials in there so that that warmth is produced. So you want the wow factor. Okay, so how do we get air into our pile? One, you could just basically use a shovel and mix it. And depending on the size of your pile, it could be, and how fast you want your compost, you could be out there mixing your pile like a couple times a week or just once a week, or it could be every month. It just determines how much time you spend in your pile will determine how fast it processes. So there's all kinds of products out there that you could use in order to get oxygen into your pile. There's a composting turner, which is this piece of equipment that you see on your screen. It has these little levers at the bottom so that they fold up while you're pushing it into the pile. But then as you're doing almost a rotating motion with that tool, those blades will go up and down and help mix the pile. Again, a pitchfork, a manure fork, a shovel, all of that is just a more accessible way of getting oxygen into your piles, just mixing it up. You could use sticks if you don't even have either any of those items. And also a PVC pipe can also help get oxygen into a large pile. And I'll show you this next slide. These are some examples of commercial facilities that are trying to get oxygen piped into their large piles. So the two pictures on the right is at Silver Springs Organics, which is just here in Rainier, where is a commercial composting facility. And what happens is these are two different methods of getting air into the pile. The one center photo are these, it's an old style. They have now since swapped out of this method, but I did want you to see that it is possible still out there. It's almost like a balloon. So what happens is they pile the materials on top of that balloon and then they inflate the balloon and the oxygen is then piped into the pile via the balloon. Now, the way the system they have in most commercial facilities use is that the air is actually piped in via the floor. So there's a series of piping of air chambers that actually forcefully push air through the floor into the pile. And so there's a bunch of holes, even though it looks like a solid surface, there's a ton of holes there where the air is being, again, forcefully pushed into the piles there. And that's how they get oxygen into those piles. If you look at the photo on the left, that's at a school. And so they had these giant earth tubs that they were filling up, but they were having a hard time getting oxygen to the center of the piles. So what they did is they took PVC pipe and almost like a smokestack, they drilled holes into that PVC pipe and then they inserted them in there so that the oxygen can freely get into the center of the pile so that the oxygen can get into the pile so that it continuously will decompose and doesn't stall. So we also have a watering video, and I would say right now our watering video is one of the more highly or higher viewed videos on our YouTube channel, just because you want to make sure that you have the right amount. You're not overwatering or underwatering. Your pile should be the consistency of a wrung out sponge. And we also have how do we know when it's actually finished at the end? And that's another video that we also offer so that folks can know at some point you're going to have to stop adding things to your pile and let it finish out. And then eventually you'll have to move that finished compost to a space where you can let it rest and cure. So let's talk about this last part of it is like, okay, we've got the pile built, we're adding oxygen to it, we're adding water to it, but now what is actually going on in the pile during during the composting process? So the hot phase typically, if you look at the chart there, the we have two axes there. The one that says temperature starts off at 80 degrees up to 100, 120, 140, 160. The bottom axis there looks at days of decomposition. So 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, 40 days. So when you mix the pile, and we have here, it's around 90 degrees between the 80 and 100 was the pile temperature when we started those piles. But what noticed is that the temperature changes as it determined based on the amount of oxygen or frequency of us turning that pile changed the temperature in which was achieved over certain days of decomposition. So if you look at the initial mixing, those piles will automatically spike in temperature, which you want. You want that to happen. And that will also, the longer that you have those higher temperatures, it will kill off some of the pathogens that would potentially be there. So you want to make sure that your pile does heat up after building it. And that's, again, making sure that you have those right ratios of greens and browns. So the first one looks at that if we were to turn the pile every 3 days, you'll see the temperature spikes from 90 all the way up to about 160 degrees. And that lasts between basically about maybe day 8 or 9, all the way through before the temperature starts going down, which is about day 20. So you should have a pretty hot pile, meaning it's going to be killing and processing those higher pathogens, but also starting to have those microbes really work on processing all of the food scraps and yard debris. If we were to only turn the pile every 10 days, look what happens. It starts off at 90 degrees, but then what happens, it spikes a little bit on day 10, but then it plateaus, meaning the temperatures don't go up any higher than maybe 125 degrees. And then you have to add some more nitrogen to get that pile started again. Then you see the spike up between maybe day 15 and 20 where the temperatures go up again, so because some nitrogen was added to the pile, but then it plateaus and then it's kind of wavy, like a little bit here. And then eventually past day 40, on to even months later, it eventually goes back down to a lower temperature. Our last line here is again starting off at 90 degrees, but if we only turn the pile every 30 days, look, it goes maybe getting to 120, but after that, it really stays stagnant at that plateau level until months and months and months later, where eventually it will finally decompose. So by you being that active person in that decomposition process, by you speeding up, by mixing that pile and making sure it has the right ingredients and the right water, it will increase those temperatures and you'll have finished compost faster. The other last thing to keep in mind is that during this process, when you're doing hot composting, is that the pile size, even though the temperatures are still elevated, your actual physical structure of your pile, it will shrink in half, and that is normal. Most folks contact us because they're like, whoa, I had a full bin, and now, 2 weeks later, it's about half the size. That's exactly what you want it to do. You want those temperatures to spike. And when they do that, what happens is the things start getting processed, and then the pile size will actually shrink in half. All right, so is it compost yet? This is where you look at the pile is no longer heating up, meaning you're not seeing steam coming off of it. You put your hand on your pile and you can't feel any heat. You turn it and you can't feel any heat at all. The material looks dark, crumbly, and is kind of sweet smelling, like it looks like up in the top right hand photo in the top right corner of your screen. And at that point, you're going to then move it from your composting unit, and you can put it into a different container where you're just going to let it sit and cure. And you really need to make sure you do the curing phase, especially if you're going to be putting this finished compost on your vegetable beds. If you put compost that is newly finished but hasn't had a chance to cure on, let's say, new seedlings, you have a risk of potentially burning your plants. And so that's why this curing phase is really critical, and is built into this 4 to 6 month process. So ultimately, you want to get that compost finished so that you can no longer tell what the original ingredients were. It looks dark, crumbly, has a kind of a sweet smelling smell to it. And then you're just going to let it sit. And ultimately, then the following gardening season, that's when you would then use it in order to put it into your beds or other ways that you could use it, which we're going to move into just after the question slide. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay, we'll keep going. All right, so at the end, so when again it looks dark, crumbly, and sweet smelling there, this is where you're going to then be able to harvest it. So you're going to take it out of your bin or your pile. It's best to screen it, so that way if there is any larger pieces that once you were processing and you might have a thicker piece of wood that didn't fully finish, but everything else you could screen it, and then your finished compost will fall to the bottom, and anything left behind can be used to build your new pile. So in this photo, what we did is we just took some wood and we took some hardware cloth, which is basically wire, stapled it to the wood to make a frame, and then we put this frame over our wheelbarrow. We put our compost on top of the screen, shook it. The finished compost falls through the screen, and any of that other larger debris that isn't quite finished yet, again, a bigger piece of wood or maybe some plant material that hadn't fully finished, it'll then stay in that screen, and then we can use that to build our new pile. The bonus part, if you do it on a wheelbarrow, is that the finished compost, then you can wheel it over to an area which you plan to cure it. So that's an easier way of just managing and moving the pile itself. So actually, how do you use the compost? So the one thing is science is evolving all the time. Originally, it was put the new compost in the actual hole in which you're planting. That is outdated science now. So the goal now is to put the compost all over the bed, not just in the planting hole, and to backfill that hole with native soil. So when you originally dug the hole, move that to the side, plant your plant, and then put that soil that you removed when digging the hole back onto the plant. And then you're going to top dress the entire bed with compost. and then you'll work it into it. So that's one way. You could apply it to your lawns. Fall right now is a perfect opportunity in order to put compost on your lawns, especially if after you've thatched your lawn. It's a great way to apply that extra nutrient layer again to your lawns. So it'll cook in all winter long, and then your lawns will be much more lush next spring. Shrubs, trees, and berries, again, ½ inch to 1 inch per year as far as the drip line of the tree or shrub. Flowers, you can do a ½ inch per year per bed. You also can mix it in your veggie beds before planting. So right now, you could leave some of your some plants, it's best to actually remove the entire plant. Others, you could actually just cut off the plant and let the roots naturally decompose over the winter time in your beds. And then ultimately, next spring, you want to put in finished compost and mix it into your vegetable beds before you plant in them. So, and if you're trying to kill the lawn, that's sheet mulching is another way that you can also incorporate composting into that process as well. So, Oregon State University did a publication during the pandemic because they had so many problems with folks not fully understanding the ratios of how to use compost. So they were over applying it or under applying it. So this Oregon State publication they put together to help folks understand how to properly use your finished compost. So that one, you don't damage your plants, but also you're getting the right amount of nutrients to your plants. All right, so what should you be, if you already have an existing pile right now, what are some things you want to be managing currently? And I would be right now stockpiling your browns. So what happens is seasonally, you tend to get either more browns or more greens. For example, in the summertime, you tend to get a lot more greens because you're deadheading. You got fresh plant material. So what happens is it tends to add to your pile. You have an excess amount of greens, but you don't have a ton of brown material in the summertime. But in the fall, you have a ton of brown material and not a lot of greens. And so what we tend to do is that extra amount of browns that you're collecting in the form of pruned out sticks or limbs that have fallen from the trees or shrubs. You have all the extra leaves that you may be collecting. All of that can be used to stockpile. So what I would do is I would dry out the leaves. I would put them in a garbage can, take my weed whacker into that garbage pile, into that garbage can, and blend them up so that you don't have to store. You can store a lot more because the size of the leaves is blended. So you break them down into smaller pieces so you can fit more in a garbage can. So that is one way I would do now. And so what happens is next spring, when I'm wanting to add in the browns, when I'm building new piles, I already have a stockpile of browns because I've already started to store them from when they are in excess, which is right now in the fall. So I always am looking at if I have more greens at a certain part of the year or more browns at the certain part of the year, I'm looking at how do I prolong the browns and so that I have more consistent methods of it. If you're in the summertime and you have a ton of green material and you're not, then and you don't have enough browns, you can use paper sources like copy paper, newspaper, cardboard as a brown source to to make sure that you have the right ratios in building your pile when you have an extra excess of green material and not enough browns. So that's how I also supplemento piles in those in the summertime when I don't have that brown resource if I didn't collect enough or store enough. So like I said here, stockpiling resources is really critical in the fall. All right, so the last couple slides here are just about troubleshooting. And so in the handout one of the links is called Backyard Composting Publication. In there is this chart. So if you currently have a pile and you're exhibiting some of these symptoms, well, if it's too wet or it smells or it's not heating up enough, it tells you the symptom, the problem, and then a solution for solving that composting problem. So this is in the Backyard Composting Publication that will be part of your resources that we're going to email you after this presentation. The other thing to keep in mind right now is that right now, mice and rats, slugs and snails, And snakes may be using your piles as winter nesting areas. So you just need to be more mindful of that. Those animals are looking for places to where can they hang out for the winter time. And so you may see these critters in your piles now. It's something to keep in mind so that you keep your pile active and moving so that way they don't try to establish and where you have an infestation of lots of slugs or snails or mice or rats in your piles. Ants are typically more of a condition that folks have in the summertime because their piles are too dry and the ants move in. As soon as you water those piles, the ants will go away. Same thing with flies. That's more of a summer issue. It's not really an issue in the fall or the spring. Spiders are actually good for your piles. They actually do a lot of managing of pests within your piles. So spiders, I would keep in the vicinity of your piles and lots of other things. Like I said, right now, you want to be mindful of if you, in your compost you see these clusters of white or clear eggs, those tend to be snail or slug eggs, and you want to remove those from your compost pile. So that way, when you produce your finished compost next spring, you're not spreading those eggs all over your garden. All right. Any questions?
There are no questions.
Okay. I think this is our last slides now. So, composting resources. We're going to be sending you a link to our website that has a ton of different information. Our links to our YouTube page, our publications, our pro and con of different bin styles, our bin plans, workshop details, all of that stuff. So, all of that is available to you. If you would like to actually attend a in-person composting workshop where we can really work with you hands-on to figure out what's working or what's not working in your piles, this is our last composting workshop for this year, but next year we will then start again monthly composting workshops. Some of them are in Zoom and some of them are in our demonstration gardens where you could come to our gardens. These are public gardens that the volunteers maintain, and we could then work with you on solving those particular composting issues with you in person. So each month we offer in-person composting workshops starting in April, typically through September, at different times and different topics. And we teach you again in person and show you how to compost that way. Here's the backyard composting publication that I was talking about that has the what's wrong with my compost pile chart, as well as just general tips about how to build a pile, how to maintain it, and also how to process it. So this publication will also be available for you in our follow-up materials. And if you have further questions, our volunteers monitor our question and answer inbox, which you can email us a question about gardening, composting, or recycling anytime. And our master gardener and master recycler composter volunteers will respond to your questions. And then, like I said, we have 3 public demonstration gardens that our volunteers also maintain. Closed Loop Park, which is out at the Thurston Hawks Prairie Waste and Recovery Center. Dirtworks, which is in Yager Park across from Capitol Mall. And then the Olympia Farmers Market Garden down at the Olympia Farmers Market in downtown Olympia. So those are the 3 garden spaces that our volunteers maintain. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's Lunch and Learn. If there's any other final questions, please let us know, or otherwise you can email us directly and then look for the follow-up email that will be sent to you.
Happy composting.
Okay, great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.